Welcome back to Deconstructing Directing. I'm Andrew Robler, the founder and archivist here. We are in the midst of Act 2, our directing identity. Scene 1 explored the importance of having a why as a director and looked at some of the ways we can define our why. Scene 2 examined imposter syndrome in the context of directing. And now in Scene 3, which I've titled Heroes, Role Models, and Individualization, we're going to examine a contributing factor to many folks' imposter syndrome and discuss how we can learn to differentiate ourselves as directors from those who have come before us. Now, there is no clear path to becoming a director, especially in upstream theater environments. Many community theaters require new directors to serve as assistant directors, which is one of the most poorly defined roles in theater, up there with dramaturg. But the experience of assistant directing can vary wildly from theater to theater and director to director. Even when this expectation isn't present, the vast majority of directors get their start by working under the leadership of one or more directors in a non-directorial role. For instance, over the past nearly 30 years that I have been acting, I've worked with quite a few directors. When I first started coaching actors in high school and took on my first directing project in college, I was heavily influenced by the directors I had worked under. I had not assistant directed for any of them, but I had seen them at work and personally felt the impact of their methods and choices. Even when I took a directing class in college, the majority of the class was about observing the work of other directors, either directly by watching our classmates work or indirectly by reading interviews with well-known directors from around the world. Based on my experiences and the conversations I've had with other directors from around the country, I feel comfortable saying that observation as training is perhaps the most common form of directing training in the US, especially in upstream environments. Unfortunately, it isn't nearly as effective as we would like it to be, and can directly contribute to the perpetuation of harmful behaviors in the rehearsal and production room. In this scene, we're going to explore some important guardrails that can be placed around the act of observation to help make this mode of training more effective. But they can also be applied after the fact as we work to understand who we are as directors and why we do what we do. At the start of this exploration, I'd like to begin by discussing two important distinctions that we as artists are not always good at making. First, it's important to understand that we are not our art. I'm going to say that again. We are not our art. It is true that especially as theater artists, the stories we tell and the process we use to tell them can be deeply personal. In fact, the most effective art is often the most personal, and so it's incredibly easy to conflate our personal identity with our art. However, this conflation also means that we often take criticism of our methods or artistic product as criticism of who we are as people. If you've ever felt the fear that if someone doesn't like your artistic work, then they don't like you as a person, you know what I'm talking about. This conflation is ingrained in many of us from our earliest experiences making art, again, because it feels so deeply personal. Unfortunately, the only way I know to fight this is to A, become aware of it, and B, learn to identify when it happens so that we can consciously contradict it. Repeated affirmations such as, I am not my art, someone cannot enjoy my art and still like me, or who I am is not defined by the art I make. These are easy to say in moments when we're not experiencing criticism. They're much harder to remember to lean on when that criticism starts to come our way. The second distinction we need to understand is similar, and that is that while they are linked, behavior is not the same as identity. In other words, someone criticizing my problematic behavior is not the same thing as them saying that I am a horrible person. Let's say I accidentally say something that is hurtful or harmful to a member of my team. It was a complete accident, but they pointed out and explained that it was hurtful. It's common for us to hear that criticism and immediately assume that they think that we did it on purpose and are therefore an awful person who intended to harm them. When we act on that assumption, it often comes across as defensiveness, and as though we are discounting the harm that they experienced. Saying, I didn't mean to do that, is not the same thing as saying I'm sorry. But for many of us, it's our first impulse, and it's an impulse because we are conflating criticism of our behavior with criticism of our identity and sense of self. These two distinctions, that we are not our art and that our behavior is not the same as our identity, are important because if we are to succeed as directors, we have to be able to look at the work of directors we have observed with care and nuance. If we are conflating their work and behavior with who they are as people in our mind, it is not only challenging to effectively deconstruct our observations, but can feel like a betrayal of people who are often incredibly formative for us as artists. Of course, not all of us have observed directors working. The good news is that what we're discussing today applies to pretty much any role model we look to as we develop our own skills as facilitators, leaders, managers, and educators/mentors. These could be supervisors at work, athletic coaches, teachers, religious leaders, or community leaders. Even in a non-artistic realm, those two distinctions still apply. So, let's talk about 3 guardrails that we can put in place as we observe our role models and/or reflect on the times we have observed them. Guardrail 1, the who and the what. This guardrail is about identifying our role models and what roles they model. It's a trope at this point, the theater director who smokes like a chimney, spitting out insightful and at times scathing observations to the actors on stage, what we might call tough love. Many people in highly stressful positions often find ourselves dependent on substances to survive, be it tobacco, alcohol, or drugs. And remember, caffeine is a drug. And perhaps this director's artistic insights are something we deeply respect, and as we work to grow as directors, we find ourselves leaning more and more on the lessons we learned by observing this director. But applying these lessons does not require us to, say, begin smoking profusely. This might seem obvious, but in my experience, it's actually quite common for someone to identify a role model and indiscriminately model their own work and identity after that person. Recognizing that you can appreciate some parts of a role model's work, such as the results, and also not like other parts, like perhaps the methodology, is a crucial guardrail to help us as we develop as directors and leaders. Guardrail 2, not only me. If you've ever been in an environment where someone else is the favorite of a leader or director, then you understand the importance of this guardrail. It can be quite upsetting to realize, but sometimes our role models treat us differently than they treat others. I once watched a faculty member who I had an excellent relationship with interact with a colleague who happened to be a woman, and it was like watching Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. After I saw that happen, I asked my other colleagues who were women if this was normal behavior, and they all said it was. Never in a million years had this person treated me the way he treated those women, and I never would have guessed that he was so rude to women had I not seen it myself. It's very easy to miss important behaviors like this because our role model likes us or sees us differently than they see others, which is why it's important to try and understand that role model's impact beyond our own experience. And that said, if it's a recent or current experience, we need to be aware that if we are currently the favorite, others may be wary of sharing their true experiences with us if they perceive that we might tell the person in question. The more time that has passed and the more honesty with which you ask for them to share their experiences, the more likely you are to get the full picture. Not responding or defending your role model when you ask these questions is also important, or else it will very quickly become known that you are not a safe person to share these experiences with. Guardrail 3, goals and outcomes. I have this very distinct memory from high school when I was working on a humorous interpretation piece for a competitive speech and debate. I had heard wonderful things about a particular coach and reached out to her for her help in making the piece stronger. All it took was one time going through it before she had what seemed like an overwhelming number of ideas and suggestions, and they were all so good. They instantly made the piece better, and I remember thinking, I want to be able to do that one day. 3 years later, I had the honor of working with a speech and debate student when I was in college and realized that I had, in fact, developed the ability to do exactly that. The way that I developed that skill after observing a role model using it in action wasn't a matter of copying the behavior of throwing out ideas. I could likely have gotten somewhere close to where I ended up eventually in that way, but it would have been a lot more painful and full of mistakes. Instead, I remember thinking about that coaching session in the car on the way home and trying to understand how she was coming up with these ideas so effectively. There was a framework in her mind of what made a performance effective, and when she saw opportunities to change something to better fit the framework, she was able to more effectively make suggestions. This is an example of not simply copying the observed behavior of a role model, but taking the time to try and understand the objectives driving them. This benefits us as directors for a couple of reasons. First, we are less likely to put someone on a pedestal if we work to understand the what and why in addition to the how. And avoiding the pedestal is important because we are more likely to conflate behavior and identity of our role models if we don't. Second, it helps us individualize the behavior so that it works best for us. No two people are going to work exactly the same way, and so what works for one person may not work for others. Sometimes this is a factor of how our brains and minds work, sometimes it just means a skill needs more practice. By looking beyond the behavior, we are able to better understand how we can apply it for best effect. Now, there are likely more guardrails on this topic. Feel free to share any that you find helpful, and we can eventually do an addendum here. For so many of us, our first directors are often ones we associate with a time we were falling in love with this art form, or those who gave us an opportunity to shine. Our favorite directors are often such because we grew as a person while working with them. But even still, observation as training is most effective when we can put up these guardrails and work to think carefully about our role models. If you're not a Patreon member and want to be, you can earn fun perks like stickers, monthly hangouts, and Q&A sessions with me, and more for helping to support this project financially. But none of this content will ever live behind a paywall. So if you can't or don't want to join the Patreon, don't worry, you'll still get all of Deconstructing Directing completely free. I'll see you again when you're ready to dive into Act 2, Scene 4, Lived Experiences and Identity. Until then, my fellow storytellers, I challenge us all to be recklessly kind.